Okay. Well, it is 9 o'clock in the morning, and we are having a very special Fire Up webinar today. So, good morning and welcome to the Fire Up training. Before we get started, just a few important notes. If you haven't already, make sure to check out our website. This is where you can find recordings of past Fire Up trainings, product information, and other helpful resources anytime, day or night. Since today's session is being recorded, please go ahead and turn off your cameras and keep your mics muted during the presentation. We'll have a Q&A at the end, so feel free to drop your questions in the chat as we go or hang on to them until the end. Don't forget to put your Fire Up trainings on your calendar for every Wednesday morning through March and attend as much as possible for a chance to win a Pit Boss pellet grill. Now, let's go ahead and get to the real reason why you're here today. What we have with us today is our very own Newfields Ag BDM, Jared Gruhl, on unlocking soil nutrient supplying power with guest speaker, Dr. Mulvaney, on P, K, and micronutrients. You want to go ahead and take it away, Jared?
I will do the best I can. Thank you, Jamie. So,
Mm-hmm.
good morning, everyone. As Jamie mentioned, my name is Jared Gruhl. When the topic of Fire Up webinars came up last October, I got really excited because Dr. Mulvaney was one of the first persons who I thought of that I wanted to speak with. And Dr. Mulvaney was one of my professors that I had back in college. And I remember distinctly one day he told me that they were dotting the I's and crossing the T's on a research study that him and Saeed were finishing up because what the hounds were going to come after them when it came out. And I have heard his presentation now on that a couple of times about potassium. And there has been another presentation of his that I've heard about nitrogen studies. And then I believe there has also been some phosphorus work. Dr. Mulvaney, feel free to correct me on that if there hasn't been. But I wanted to bring you on for a discussion about all of this. So, Dr. Mulvaney, anything I missed in your introduction, sir?
No, you did a good job, but we have not really worked on phosphorus.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Nitrogen and potassium are fair game, but we have not really got to P.
So, sir, in fairness to you, I guess I would like to let you lead. Which one do you think is probably the more impactful to farmers given the current situation in the moment? Nitrogen, potassium. Which one do you feel like we can probably have the most influence with at the moment in the discussion?
I guess I'd have to say potassium is the better candidate because oftentimes it just has no real value for increasing yield. There's simply so much in the soil. And the soil test that we rely upon to make K recommendations turns out it's pretty much worthless. It doesn't work, and it never did. But we thought it did, and I thought it did, but I was wrong. And it all goes back to the fact that the soil has lots of this nutrient, and most of what the soil has would be in forms that are not measured by soil testing. And yet they are the reserves that resupply what we do measure by soil testing. That's the heart of the problem. So I learned about potassium working with Saeed because he had worked on it for a number of years, both in Pakistan and here in the US for his master's and PhD projects.
Okay. Sir, before we get too deep into it, could I ask you to outline your general findings of that paper for everyone? And if it's possible, can we make that available for people to see, have sent out to them?
Oh, sure. I can supply you with that paper.
Very
and
good.
With a couple of letters that came from it. They might be interesting reading as well. But the bottom line is we took on the issue of both K testing and K fertilizer response. And it was a huge project. I think it took us 2 or 3 years to write that paper. And we dug through the literature in a big way, ended up with about 500 references. And the bottom line of the message in that paper would be first, that K testing doesn't work because the exchangeable fraction that we measure is not synonymous with plant available K. That's the heart of the problem. The reserve forms are resupplying the exchangeable form, but we're only measuring the exchangeable form. So
So there was
go
a
ahead.
podcast. There was a podcast that you were on with Rod, and you made a statement how the soil is literally oozing out K.
Yes, that's true.
And I found that an interesting statement. How there's just all this K in the soil, and it actually got me thinking about another podcast that I listened to, and they talked about all the potassium that's in like feldspar and rocks and such like that, and stuff that there's all this K that we can't pick up, or it is in the soil. It's just how do we get to it?
So, I mean, we get to it by letting nature take its course. That, that's, that's how it works. The reserve forms that are held between the layers of clay and in the minerals,
Mhm.
they keep supplying potassium. Potassium is the 8th most abundant element in the Earth's crust. There's a lot of it there, and it just keeps on coming. We can't stop it. It's kind of like deer in the field. You're not going to keep them out. Forget it.
So, I and I will say in my professional career post college life, I have found what you said to be true. I actually came across one grower who was having. He came to me and he said, "I'm spreading all kinds of potash, but my K levels are not increasing." But and I looked at him and I said, "Sir, stop spreading potash." After looking at a soil test, and I said, "For the amount of potash that you've spread, looking at your soil test here, let's let's go get some gypsum and try and flush some of this magnesium out of your freshly tiled soil to see if this would help." And it was amazing that we came back the next year and pulled soil samples, and his base saturation Ks had jumped like a point and a half or something like that for
Oh,
not
yes.
having any potash spread. So,
Yes. Yeah, I have a related story to that, very, very similar actually. We heard of a case in Ohio where a field tested low for K, and so the order was placed to put on potash, and it was applied. Well, they thought it was applied, and they made the mistake of retesting the field, and they found out that the test levels went down. And the manager of the fertilizer company got up in a big huff and told the driver, "Well, you dummy, you fertilized the wrong field. Go out and do it again." So he went out and applied a second round of potash, and they retested again, and the test value was lower. And this can happen because potassium has the effect of getting in between the clay layers. It collapses the clay, and when it does, it reduces the surface area and it lowers the CEC. It literally can lower the test value by applying more potash.
when you say test value, because there's two test values on a soil test that indicate K. And I find that a lot of people look at the pounds of K per acre. There's also the base saturation K. How would you rank those in terms of importance, or what should we weight one over the other? Uh, I
Uh,
I I know
uh,
what you're talking about by reducing surface area, but for those that need help.
sure. I would rate the K saturation and the exchangeable K test level at 0. Neither
Okay.
one has any meaning. The reason being that the fraction we're measuring, the exchangeable fraction,
Mhm.
it's not stable. it keeps getting resupplied from the reserve in the clay and in the minerals. So the test value is like taking a snapshot out here on I-74 and saying, oh, that's the traffic for this day. That's it. We had 7 cars. That's it. No, that's not how it works. It keeps coming. It's oozing out. You can't stop it. And the exchangeable fraction does not give you an adequate assessment. Nope.
Kind of like I-74 back when it was under road construction. I'd sure love to know when there was only 7 cars on that interchange there. That had to have been 2:30 in the morning at some point or another. So the exchangeable fraction, we have this amount that's bound up in the soil. And you made a statement that we need to let nature take its course when pulling this from the soil. And you mentioned collapsing clay sheets and such like that. How would you open up those? I'm assuming that opening up those clay sheets would help nature take its course. Is that one thing that we can work on to doing that? And how would you do that? How would you advise to that nature?
Yes, opening the clay helps a lot to restore the CEC and even to improve water storage between the clay layers. You're gaining space in there. And how to do it? Well, I would suggest liming. Let's let calcium have a competitive advantage to replace some of that fixed K. Now, it's going to take time. That fixed K is held tightly. But over time, if you have more calcium in the soil, it can start to get in between the clay layers and loosen them up.
Neil Kinsey's applauding somewhere, sir. How does by what mechanism does calcium help to open up the soil and influence K availability?
Has many benefits. So one factor is what we've just mentioned. It becomes a more dominant cation on the exchange complex.
Is that because of the charge?
Yeah,
the charge of it?
Right. It's a competitive cation. And if they were on an equal footing, calcium would outcompete potassium. The problem is they're not on an equal footing because potassium gets fixed in the clay, whereas calcium will not be fixed. It's too big to be fixed like K is. But it is a competitive cation, and it will loosen the soil as it accumulates on the exchange sites. It has a whole variety of benefits. One of them is that it builds aggregation. Potassium does not do that. Potassium kind of compacts the soil. Calcium opens it up. So if you have a looser soil with better aggregation, it means you have a better aerated soil, one that has more macro porosity and takes in more water when it rains. That's real good. That's a very good thing. And as you loosen that soil and build the porosity, you're going to gain more biological activity. The roots grow easier because the bulk density is actually decreasing. And the microbes are more active because they have better supplies of oxygen to support their respiration. So they're more active, and that means they're cycling nutrients more effectively when they have these benefits. And then calcium also has the benefit of coupling clay to organic matter. We call it complexation. And the calcium stabilized aggregates accumulate organic matter over time. They protect the organic matter by coupling it to clay. So we're building organic matter in that limed soil over time. Now, these changes may not occur in the first year after liming. They may take time, but they will have an effect over time, and especially if liming is a regular practice. So there's more and more input of calcium.
I suspect in that example I gave earlier of the gentleman that we spread gypsum on his soil, part of the reason why he responded so well was because there was such a artificially high reserve of potassium already applied, and you couldn't push the spring down anymore. Is what I
Yes,
suspect. Is
yes,
that a sufficient analogy?
yes. One day we had a visit from a guy up at Gifford, and he had seen our K paradox paper, and he was agreeing with what we said about the effects of calcium because he'd seen it on his own farm. He said for years he had gotten bottom ash from ADM in Decatur, and he had applied it as gypsum. And he said it had really loosened his soil. It was getting softer and softer, and his yields were climbing. Saeed's father-in-law up near Streeter had the same experience with liming. He had a problem back some years ago where he'd had several of these windmills installed on his land. And of course, when they installed the windmills, they compacted the soil. So he had a problem with standing water. And he said his soybeans were miserable in those areas. Yield was down around 20 bushels an acre. So he asked Saeed, what can I do to improve this? And we had, at that time, we had been in contact with Growers Mineral Solutions, who that company preaches the importance of liming, and they don't sell lime, but they preach it. So Saeed suggested to his father-in-law, why don't you try liming those areas with calcitic lime from Pontiac? That's what he started doing. And within 2 or 3 years, the areas that had been his lowest yielding were now his highest. And so he gets the idea, why don't I do this on all my land? And he started liming every year, working it in with a deep chisel, maybe 8, 9 inches. And it started to have an effect. And he started growing continuous soybeans. And man, I was up there with Saeed back in 2015 in September. It was remarkable. He had, I think that was the third year of soybeans. And his neighbor, who did not believe in liming, but subscribed to the NPK philosophy, his field, you didn't need a fence to see the boundary between the two farms. It was clear as day. The neighbor's field on the same soil type was showing that the crop was done. The factory was finished. It was a going out of business sale. You had residues accumulated on the soil, and he ends up with a yield around 20 bushels an acre. And right next to it, you had Saeed's father-in-law's land. The plants were going gangbusters in September, tall, dark green, loaded with pods, and his yield was 60 to 70 bushels that year on a soil that's not very productive, Swigert. It made all the difference in the world, all the difference. And I can't imagine why his neighbor didn't knock on his door and ask, why are your beans so much better than mine? It was obvious. So liming turned his farm around, absolutely turned it around.
So, because I would like to talk just briefly about nitrogen. I want to, for lack of a better term, put a little bit of a bow tie on this. Make sure I give you enough time to talk about that. In terms of unlocking potassium availability in the soil, your suggestion is to work on the reserve to exchangeable fraction, if I would suggest, by opening up soils. I'm going to ask you a question on that. I would also like, because I already know the answer to that question and to this story. Can you tell the story briefly about the bricks in Pakistan that Saeed would share about how they make the bricks harder or
Yeah,
better bricks?
yeah, yeah. That's Saeed's told that story many times. And the way it goes is that he was an agricultural extension advisor in Pakistan before he came back to grad school here. And one day he was up at a farmer's place where they had who they've been working with to give him inputs that would increase productivity under the Green Revolution protocols. And that included potash. And he's up at this farmer's property, and the farmer is building a wall. And Saeed notices he has a bag of fertilizer, potash fertilizer, muriate of potash, that he's mixing in to make that mud wall. And Saeed says, what are you doing with this? This is a fertilizer. We apply it to your fields to supply potassium. Why are you putting this in the mud to make this wall? And the farmer told him, oh, this makes a much stronger wall. It ends up much more dense and it lasts much longer. So the potassium was literally compacting that soil that he was making that mud wall with, and he ends up with a much more durable wall. Yeah, that was the story. And Said said he didn't understand anything about it back then. But years later, after he had done more work on potassium, the light began to dawn. So he said the farmer was way ahead of me.
And and I see that all the time as I'm shoving soil probes into the ground. And I've actually got a pair of boots that cried uncle when my foot slipped off the probe because the ground was so hard and the stomper ripped the side out of the boot. I sent the farmer and a text, and I said your soils are crying uncle for potash and anhydrous. Please stop. Send him a picture of it as well.
Oh, yeah.
And for the former question of my last statement, as far as opening up soils, you profess lime for opening up the soils. Uh, is is there a type of lime in particular that you prefer? And then, if a person does need to apply some form of potassium, per the conversation here, preferably not potash, what do you think your preferred method would be as a very general, non-nuanced statement?
Okay, good points. First, as to the type of lime that I would recommend, I would just go with the idea that more calcium is better. You don't want to build up magnesium with dolomitic lime because magnesium does not have the same physical benefits as calcium. Magnesium has more water around it. So it's not a good coupling agent. It doesn't build aggregates. And in fact, it can actually disperse them, kind of like potassium. So you don't want to put high rates of dolomitic lime on, but you can put high rates of calcitic on, and the soil will get softer and softer and softer. So that's the first point. Let's see, the second one that you asked about was what form of potassium would I recommend? And here's another really important point that I didn't understand for years. The point is that when we apply muriate of potash, we're applying chloride. Now that chloride is not really something you want to be applying. One of the effects it has is that it ends up competing with nitrate for plant uptake. You really don't want to do that. So you're helping to close the door for taking up nitrate that you've invested in with a lot of fertilizer in, most likely. And now you're helping to keep it out of the plant. And when you keep it out of the plant, you're probably going to lose more by leaching or denitrification. So you don't want to add chloride. And with that in mind, my advice would be don't apply muriate. Instead, apply sulfate of potash, K2SO4, because sulfate, unlike chloride, does not compete with nitrate. And it's a nutrient that the plant needs. It needs sulfur. So so it makes sense if you can get access to potassium sulfate, that would be the preferred form. And just one more minor point here on potash,
Go
and
right
that
ahead,
is
sir.
you don't need to worry about the test levels or the saturation because they don't mean anything. And if you're concerned that you may have a K deficiency, our advice was do some strip trials with a zero rate and see if there's any effect on yield. That's the best way to assess whether there's a potash problem.
It's an unfair statement for me to bring this, but you open the door a little bit. We've got roughly 5 minutes. Jamie can flag me one way or the other if we need to stop here. But you mentioned chlorine for nitrates, and I know you did another presentation at a meeting I was at 2 years ago down in Windsor, Illinois, about supplying power of nitrogen in the soils.
Yeah,
within 15 and such. So, any
yes,
comments you would like to share on that?
yeah, that's a story that taught me a lot, a lot. Um, it came about because of my student Kelsey Gresham, who wanted to do field studies with N15, and we set forth to compare different placement, timing, and forms of N in terms of uptake efficiency. We started with fall applied ammonia. First study ever done on that with N15, the only one. And, we hear reports every now and then that this fall applied ammonia is amazingly efficient. We've heard stories of 90% or even 100% ends up in the corn. And my advice is don't believe it. So we did a study with labeled ammonia, and a year after the ammonia had been applied, what we find out is on average for 6 sites where we did the work, we had 21% recovery of the fall applied ammonia in the corn grain, 28% in the total above ground biomass. A far cry from 90 or 100%. That's
Just
how
doing the
it
math,
works.
that's 49%.
Yeah, yeah,
So where did the other 51 go?
yeah. Well, you can imagine some of it's a fair amount stayed in the soil and gone through the microbial biomass. But of course, you might suspect we had some losses by leaching or denitrification. So yeah, it's not taken up by the plant, and it's not going to be. It's not going to be. And then the other important finding from that work. So we started with fall applied ammonia, but then we did 3 other studies. One on starter fertilizer with UAN, another for in-season placement with UAN, and we applied the side dressing either with Y drops or knife injection. And then the last study was on forms of in-season N. We compared nitrate, potassium nitrate. I wish we'd used calcium nitrate, but we did potassium nitrate, and we did UAN and a liquid urea solution. Now here's the bottom line. When we set out those studies, they were done at the same sites in the same years as the fall applied ammonia. Same sites. And I remember we were laughing at the time, man, this is a no contest. We're going to get way higher uptake efficiency if we give the corn the N in season. It's got to be compared to fall applied ammonia. And here is the kicker. I was wrong. In that study, the uptake efficiency was virtually identical for applying the N at V9 as opposed to fall applied ammonia. Virtually the same. Again, 28% for total above ground biomass, around 21, 22% for the grain. it didn't make any difference. And what that work showed us from the studies we did is that the soil dominated the N uptake by the time of harvest. In every study, regardless of how we applied the N or when we applied it, the soil was the dominant source. And it confirmed the idea that poor soils need more fertilizer, good soils need less. That's what it showed.
It was an unfair request of me to ask you to do that in 4 or 5 minutes, or however we said. That may be a topic for a whole nother day, sir, if you would
Oh, it
entertain
is.
it, because your presentation that day was, I think, at least an hour long, and it was very interesting, sir. So uh, I would ask for any closing thoughts you have before we wrap up the recording and it open up to questions from anyone, and see what you have, sir. So the floor is yours for roughly the next 2.5 minutes, sir.
Well, my only closing thoughts are that given the economic challenges that farmers are facing today, it's really important that they can find ways to cut input costs. Um, and what I've learned in our work on both nitrogen and potassium is that oftentimes we don't need near the inputs that farmers normally use. That's true of nitrogen, and it's even more true of potassium. And if I was a farmer in this economic climate, and I wanted to find some way to cut my cost of production, my first stop would be potassium. It's probably not paying its way. And it gives a great opportunity to save money and boost profits. Nitrogen, of course, is more critical. Usually, but not always, it's going to raise yields. But we may not need as high a rate as we're used to using. So we might even be able to cut that one back, but you have to be careful so you don't go to the point where you're stressing the corn and cutting the yield. So those are my comments.
Dr. Mulvaney, I asked earlier, can those papers be made available to people who ask about it from Stephanie and from your the potassium paradox?
Absolutely. I will send those over to you as email attachments. Yes.
Sir, I love talking with you. I look forward to it every time. There's been many times where I've reached out to you with questions, and I've re-listened to several podcasts that you've been on as well. So thank you for your time today, sir. Jamie, can I cast it to you to close us out, and then we'll
Sure
open it up to
can.
questions?
Of course. Thank you. Thank you so much, Jared and Dr. Mulvaney. We really appreciate your time today for a wonderful presentation. We will now go ahead and move into our Q&A section for the next 10-15 minutes. We're going to discontinue the recording at this time and encourage you to take this time to ask the experts your questions. We'll answer the questions that if there was any that came over in the chat and came through during the training. And if you held on to your questions, please raise your hand or unmute yourself to ask your questions. If you think of a question at a later time, please reach out to your local Newfields Ag reseller or business development manager or contact the office. All contact information can be found on the newfieldsag.com website. And if you're dropping off now, please, we hope that you have a blessed day and thank you for joining us. All right, I'm going to stop the recording. And the floor is up for questions and discussion.
I will take, as chair of the meeting, I will take one that I would like to ask you, sir. So when we're opening up these clay sheets as a way to influence the reserve fraction, is there any bacterial or microbial process to help improve that? And I ask in some ways because Newfields does have a couple of products that helps with nutrient solubility. What has been your experience with that?
Well, I have no experience working with microbial products, and certainly not in the case of K management. One point I would make and that is that potassium is unique among the major nutrients because it does not undergo microbial cycling and it does not occur in organic forms. It's always inorganic. It occurs that way in the clays and the minerals. It occurs that way in the plant. It's present as salts, always inorganic. Now, could the microbes have any effect on loosening up the clay and increasing access? I'm not aware that they could, but I am aware from working with Saeed that organic matter itself can get into that inner layer space and prevent the collapse. It can keep the inner layers more open and accessible.